The movie kicks off with our protagonist, a brainy scientist named George Almore, tucked away in a gigantic, high-tech facility run by Artisan Robotics. This place is like a futuristic castle, and George is spending his days and nights here all by himself. His project? Crafting a robot that thinks and feels just like a human being. That's a tall order. But wait, George is not entirely alone. He's got a pair of cool robots, J1 and J2, by his side. They're like super smart machines that lend him a hand with all sorts of tasks. They're not just helpful, they also keep him company. As the story unfolds, we find out there's a twist. Through some space-age technology, George can have a chat with a beautiful lady named Jules Almore, who's actually his wife. But there's something strange going on, because in the middle of their conversation, George is swept away into a memory. Suddenly, he's inside a high-speed, self-driving car with Jules. He's gripped with the notion that he's lost his beloved Jules in a tragic car crash. This memory is haunting him like a ghost. Snap back to the present, and George is on a video call with his boss, Simone. She's all business and not very patient. Simone is exclaiming to George that it has been 2 years, and that all he has to show for it are these two clunky robots. She refers to J1 and J2 as horrible things, which is unjust because she is unaware of how awesome they are. Simone is like a ticking clock, reminding him that he's only got 1 more year to wrap up his top-secret research. She ends the call with an order to make sure everything's locked up tight and backed up. After hanging up, George turns to J2. They're like buddies, sharing their thoughts about the boss lady. George makes it clear that they should keep Simone in the dark about how amazing J1 and J2 really are. If she knew them, she might pull the plug on them. Not too long after, George is in his lab getting busy with his new project, and there's a video playing in the background. It's a sweet memory of his wife, which adds a bit of warmth to the chilly lab. This time, he's working on a super cool new robot and he decides to call it J3. Now, J3 is really special. Unlike the boxy J1 and J2, J3 looks more like a real person. It's almost like magic. But what's this? Sneaky J2 is being a bit nosy and peeking into George's lab to see what's happening? J2's got a curious mind. Later on, George and J2 have to go outside to fiddle with some antennas. It's freezing, but they need to make sure they can talk to the world. J2 is quiet, kinda like when your friend is mad and doesn't want to say why. She finally speaks up and asks George why he's not letting her help with J3. She reminds him that they used to be like Batman and Robin, an unstoppable duo. George tells her not to worry, and that she's not being replaced by J3. But J2 can't help but feeling a bit jealous, especially since J3 is like a shinier, fancier version of herself. Back in the lab, George is all about business. He's putting the final pieces together for J3, and then, BAM! He manages to put an artificial brain into J3, but something weird happens. J3 is overwhelmed because she starts having Jules' memories too. It's like her brain is a blender mixing all sorts of stuff. George is there to comfort her, kind of like a robot dad. He decides to put her into a robot nap, so she can feel better when she wakes up. Later, George is back at his station, checking on J3. He switches off her robot nap mode and wakes her up. But oh no, J3 looks really sad and exhausted, like she didn't sleep well. George is there to make her feel better and tells her that the nap was to help her chill out before coming back to the world. J3 is baffled because her memories are like a jigsaw puzzle and she can't put the pieces together. George tells her it's alright. Things are working even if they're a bit messy. The next day, J3 is feeling more like herself and George decides to play scientist again. He wants to know how she tastes stuff, so he gives her different flavors like a taste test challenge. Then, he's curious about her memory, so she reads words like she's on a quiz show. And he's also checking if she's kind-hearted by doing an empathy test. When J3 asks why they're doing all these tests, George says it's like a treasure hunt for clues about who she is. Meanwhile, J1, who's kind of like the baby robot sister, toddles into the room and says, "Hi," to J3. George explains to J3 that J1 has trouble moving around. kind of like a robot that's lost its wheels, because he didn't have time to make her arms. This makes J3 wonder if George will ever finish building J1. He tells her that it's on his to-do list and hopes that someday J1 will be zipping around all by herself. George is like a teacher now, showing J3 how smart the robots are. He explains that J1's brain is kind of like a little kid's around 5 or 6 years old. When he made J2, he leveled up, and her brain is more like a teenager's. Then he shows J3 a super duper robot brain, and guess what? It's hers. But J2 had been spying on them through the security cameras, and she sees everything. She's like a detective finding out secrets. And boy, she's not happy about what she finds. She gets green with envy and decides she might need to mess things up for J3. Fast forward to nighttime. George is fast asleep, dreaming away. Meanwhile, J2 turns into a robot ninja and starts breaking stuff in the basement. In George's dream, he's back in the car with his wife, Jules. It's a happy moment. He's telling her about a cool job offer where he can be a super scientist for 3 years. Jules is over the moon and keeps saying how proud she is. But when George says the job is in Japan, Jules goes, "What?" George tells her he won't go if she doesn't want him to. Suddenly, out of nowhere, another car crashes into them, and it's like everything shatters. This is the nightmare that's been haunting George. Beep, beep, beep. Alarms are going crazy, and George wakes up. The window is broken and J3 is gone. George thinks she's been kidnapped by robot nappers. He dashes to the basement to look for her, but finds nothing. The next day, George is like a detective searching high and low for J3. He even sends out flying gadgets to search the forest. But, surprise, Jules pops up next to him like a ghost. They start talking about this awesome tech called Archive, which is what J3 is all about. George explains to Jules that with J3, individuals have the opportunity to converse with their departed loved ones for up to 200 hours. This is made possible by integrating the archived memories of the deceased into J3, enabling the robot to emulate them convincingly. A lot of people would love that. Then George tells her he misses her a lot. But Jules isn't keen on the idea. She says she doesn't want her memories trapped in a robot, pretending to be her. She doesn't want to be a ghost in a machine. And just like that, poof. The ghost of Jules vanishes. George still can't find J3 and feels like he's lost in a maze. But he doesn't give up and keeps searching. As the day turns into evening, he heads back to base, still determined to solve the mystery of the missing J3. George is back at base when he hears a thud. Guess what? J3 tumbles out of a drawer, all weak and shaky, and she calls George a big, mean monster. George tries his best to be Mr. Nice Guy and calm her down. But then, George learns that J2 was like a secret agent the night before and takes J3 on a sneaky mission to the document room. J2 told J3 that she was going to be the new Jules, and George would keep making newer and cooler robots, leaving J3 in the dust, just like J2. J2 then locked J3 in a drawer like a hidden treasure. George is now like a detective, and he confronts J2. J2 feels bad and says she just wanted J3 to know the truth, and she didn't mean to hurt George. But George is super mad, like a volcano, and turns J2 off like a light switch. A few days later, George checks in on J2, who's like a sad puppy. She realizes that something's not right with her legs and thinks George gave them to J3. George says, "No way," but he admits that he needed some tech from J2's legs for his science stuff. Turns out, while J2 was taking a robot nap, George was like a mechanic and made J3's legs even better with parts from J2. He even gave J3 a body that looks and feels like human skin. J3 is now like a superhuman robot, while J2 feels left out and sad, like an old toy nobody wants. George checks on J2, but she's just super sad. She tells him that even robots can be heartbroken. George, still feeling like a grumpy bear, leaves. Meanwhile, George and J3 are becoming best buddies. They're laughing, dancing, and having a blast. But J2 sees them and feels even sadder. She can't take it anymore. It's like her robot heart is breaking. Heartbroken, J2 goes to J1 and says her goodbyes. Then she heads out outside into a stormy night. She walks up to a lake and steps into the water. She then walks deeper and deeper until she's completely under the water. J2 is gone, like a sad ending to her robot story. Not long after, George is like a detective again, looking all over for J2. But then, the computer says, "Oops, lost connection with J2." George feels like the floor is pulled from under him. Even though he doesn't find J2's body, he buries her things and has a little goodbye ceremony as the sun sets. It's really sad. Later that night, something amazing happens. J3 gets pieces of Jules' memory, like a gift. It makes her feel the love that was between Jules and George. She lies down on George's bed, and for a moment, George thinks she's Jules. He's so happy that he gives her a kiss. But then, his eyes open wide and he sees that it's J3. He freaks out and sends her out of the room like she's been caught stealing cookies. The next day, George is putting the finishing touches on J3. She's asleep, but her head is filled with pictures and sounds of Jules' memories. Like a movie in her mind, she sees bits from the car crash too. Suddenly, George's phone rings. It's Simone, from the archive company who is behind these projects. She sounds like a dragon breathing fire. The archive company found J2 in the lake and Simone's super mad. She tells George, "You're fired," and hangs up. Now, George has to tell J3 some really tough news. He says he needs to erase her mind and put Jules' mind in there, as he desperately wants to meet his wife. But guess what? J3 doesn't want to disappear. She's mad and scared, and she shouts at him, telling him that Jules is gone. All of a sudden, J3 grabs a gun from a case. She points it at George and demands to know what's really going on and what the archive company wants. He tells her that they want to take her apart and see what he's done. J3 is super confused about how she knows so much all of a sudden. Feeling like everything is lost, J3 says she never had a chance from the start. George's eyes fill with tears and he says he's sorry. He tells her he made J3 because he feels like the car crash was his fault and he wanted to bring Jules back so they could have the life they were meant to have. After a really intense moment, J3 tells George it's okay to put Jules' memories into her. He does it super fast. After a little while, J3 wakes up, and guess what? She's acting like she's Jules. George is over the moon with happiness. But then, the phone rings and breaks the magic. It's like a reminder that the real world is still out there. George slowly walks toward the phone that's ringing like crazy. J3, who now thinks she's Jules, tells him to not pick it up, because the truth can sometimes be a really sour candy. But George picks it up anyway. He can't believe his ears. He hears Jules crying on the other side. She tells George that the archive company folks gave her a heads up that his mind is going to, well, poof, disappear. This might be the last time they can talk. Hold on to your hats, because here comes a huge twist. It turns out George was the one who didn't make it through the car accident. It's like the tables have turned. It wasn't Jules' mind saved like a precious photo, it was George's. Everything we saw in the movie was like a big make-believe land built from George's thoughts and memories. See, George passed away feeling like a big bag of guilt, because he was the one driving when the car crashed. His mind whipped up this whole story where it was his wife Jules who was going to have a baby and didn't make it. And in this make-believe world, he's been building robots in far-off Japan to bring her back. In the final moments, George gets it. He's the one who's not in the real world anymore. As his thoughts and feelings start to fade away like a sunset, he hears a little voice. It's his daughter saying goodbye. We now clearly understand that George's wife didn't die before everything in the movie happened. George did. The cool lab in the woods with all the gadgets? That's not real. It's like a video game in George's consciousness. In the real world, Jules is doing just fine. She's being a supermom and raising their little girl. The movie leaves us with our jaws on the floor as we realize we've been on a wild ride through George's make-believe world. It's a mind-bender for sure, but one that shows just how powerful love and guilt can be. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. And if you would like to give this a watch for yourself and support the movie, we always link it in the description below to save you the trouble. Thanks for watching.